Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. This is Large Man Abroad, and today I want to dive into something that is a little bit controversial and has been really the topic of conversation for the past few years now. And that of course is America's trade war with China. But here's the twist. We're going to explore, despite all the hype, why it's set up to fail. And no, it's not because I'm some kind of left-wing economist or some kind of anti-Trump pundit. I'm just breaking it down logically as an observer and someone who watches the markets, the policies, and the economies all over the world. I think from tariffs to sanctions to back and forth negotiations, the story's been running on for a while, but the fact is, has it really worked? Before we can talk about why this trade war is destined for failure, we need to understand how it started. The roots of this conflict are deep and they're tied to decades of economic changes. In the simplest terms, the US and China have been in a battle for economic global dominance for decades now. But it officially started in 2018 when the US and Trump imposed tariffs on China. So let's take a step back to understand the underlying issues. China's rise as an economic powerhouse starting in the early 2000s has really created a lot of tension. The US has long been the world's largest economy, but China's growth has really eaten at that position. And that's because with China's massive industrial base, cheap labor, and the ability to scale products fast, it became the factory of the world. Meanwhile, the US relied heavily on importing manufactured goods from China, which helped keep inflation low and goods affordable for consumers. In 2018, President Trump said enough is enough. The US was running a massive trade deficit with China, and he wanted to bring that down, reduce the trade imbalance, and keep China from getting too far ahead of us technologically. The US imposed tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars worth of Chinese goods, and in turn, China retaliated, and this is how the trade war began. Now let's break down the assumptions of the trade war, because the question we have to ask is, why would the US think that this would work? And the theory was pretty simple. Tariffs would make Chinese products more expensive in the United States, which would push American consumers to purchase domestically made products. And at the same time, the hope was that Chinese manufacturers and industrialists would lose that competitive edge, leading to a reduction in China's global market share. But of course, here's the problem with that logic. Tariffs are like a double-edged sword, because yes, they can make Chinese goods more expensive in America, but the fact is they also hurt the American consumer. Because after all, these tariffs, they don't just hit Chinese manufacturers. They hurt US importers, retailers, and ultimately the American consumer. And this, of course, affects the poorest of Americans the most, because it's the poorest of Americans that consume the most cheap goods from China. And this includes everything from electronics to clothing, to the materials that we need to build our houses and even our food. The truth is, Americans are still going to buy products, but now they're paying more for them. And in the end, that means less disposable income for the average American. So what happens then is that you have the average Americans bearing the brunt of this conflict and all of the consequences, really, of this trade war between the US and China, between Trump and Xi. And while the intention is for those consequences to be borne by China, the fact is it really isn't. And guess what? The trade deficit didn't actually even shrink. In fact, despite the tariffs, the US deficit continued to grow in the years following this trade war. And that's one of the reasons I say that the tariffs really aren't going to balance the scales, right? So if the trade war wasn't affecting or wasn't hurting China as much as people thought it was going to, then why wouldn't China just cave in, really? Well, here's the thing. China has options, and it's a lot more resilient than people tend to give it credit for. People in America think that China is just, one bad decision away from an economic collapse or the people revolting. But that really isn't the case. But first, let's talk about how China actually responded to the tariffs. China doubled down on its own economic strategy. They invested heavily in tech and innovation in order to kind of break its reliance on Western companies. Think of things like 5G, AI, renewable technologies, and electric cars. Over the past decade, China focused on improving and growing its manufacturing base. And the fact is, these just aren't cheap goods anymore. They're high-tech, cutting-edge products. The quality of them speaks for themselves. It's not like it used to be. Chinese products are actually in high demand globally. In fact, the Chinese government has been actively supporting domestic industries with massive subsidies and investments in R&D. While the US focused on tariffs, China went on a full-on innovation spree, making itself less vulnerable to external pressures. And here's another big factor. China has the advantage of having a massive internal market. It doesn't need to rely solely on the US for trade. In fact, China's Belt and Road Initiative improved its relations and trade partnerships with Africa, Southeast Asia, and Europe. So while America was busy with tariffs, China diversified its trading partners. making the impact of the trade war far less severe than I think America really anticipated it to be. Now let's talk about some of the unintended consequences of the trade war, because there have been some serious ones that people really didn't expect. For one, American companies have been hurt by the tariffs too. A lot of companies that rely on China for parts and finished goods, have been met with a lot higher production cost. And what did they do? Well, they started moving their manufacturing to other countries, particularly in Southeast Asia, to avoid tariffs. This means that the job losses that the tariffs were intended to help prevent actually happened anyway, just not in the way that people thought. Vietnam, Thailand, and Mexico really became manufacturing hubs for a lot of these companies, meaning the US isn't necessarily going to bring jobs back. It's just shifting them elsewhere. And if the goal was to reduce China's manufacturing power, that backfired too, because now China is less dependent on the US market, but American firms are still dependent on global and foreign supply chains. And we shouldn't forget about the global supply chain. The US and China trade war disrupted it, causing delays and shortages worldwide. We've seen shortages from everything from semiconductors to shipping containers. And in the end, the American consumer paid the higher price and the global market took a hit. So when we take a step back and look at everything, the picture's pretty clear. America's trade war with China really wasn't designed to win. It was designed to hurt China, but inevitably it hurt America too. America is stuck in a catch-22. The tariffs hurt Chinese business, yes, but they also hurt the American consumer. And the US isn't getting tech from China, but China's innovations have advanced, and it's diversified its markets. And the kicker, in the end, the trade deficit still wasn't reduced. It didn't and won't bring back manufacturing in any significant way, really. In the end, the trade war was a misguided attempt to solve a structural problem. The US economy is tied to China in ways that tariffs can't undo. And this goes beyond the economic. It goes into our cultural. It goes into the psychology of our people. That's why the future has to lie in cooperation and not confrontation. So what's the takeaway here? The US trade war might have had great intentions, noble intentions really, to try to bring jobs back to America, but it's inherently flawed and it's incredibly unlikely to actually achieve its goals. The assumptions behind it were wrong. The strategies were misguided, and the consequences are much more far-reaching than those who are very far away from the consequences, those on the higher end of the socioeconomic spectrum, will really ever feel. If we want to see real change, we have to think far beyond the tariffs, beyond the trade wars. The future of global economics is something about cooperation and sharing innovation, creating win-win scenarios for everyone. Because as wealth disparity increases between individuals, governments, corporations, things are going to get much more difficult, and the world's becoming a much smaller place. So in order for us to avoid the conflicts that we've had in the past, because those aren't something we want to go back to, we have to find a new road into the future. And it can't be through an ideology of, we need to do the best while everyone else suffers. Because that's kind of where this comes from. We need to understand the consumer culture in America and how it really has done damage on a lot of global economies, especially on a lot of the countries and economies in much poorer areas that we take advantage of. A lot of our resources, a lot of our products, come from situations and living conditions and work conditions that we wouldn't tolerate in America. And we never see it, because if we saw it, we'd have to realize that it's something that we're taking advantage of. And because of our spending choices, our habits, and our pursuit of certain lifestyles, that we're causing massive pain to many people in the world. True oppression by corporations who are working to build these products, to make them as cheaply as possible so they can ship them over to the States and sell them at a cheap price. Because we are a country that is addicted to cheap goods. We are. And the idea is to just produce them internally. The need isn't there. In order for people to actually move to purchase domestic goods, what we need to do is create desperation and scarcity of foreign goods. But at the same time, we know supply and demand. So American products are already cheaper, but if you create scarcity in the market and the only products that are available are American products, and those products take more to produce, cost more to produce, and in general can't really meet with the American demand for the supply, then the cost of those products would just skyrocket. And that would be on pretty much anything that's made here, where we blocked foreign imports. And again, who suffers the most from this? Because it isn't the people in the highest reaches of government, the highest reaches of society. The people who are talking about it on TV, it doesn't affect them, whether it goes good or it goes bad. If it goes good, it's a feather in their cap. But if it goes wrong, they're just going to go to an island somewhere and just, it's talk about their time in politics, their time in power, because that's really all that matters to these people. It's either their time in power or the assets that they've accumulated and how that reflects on the power that they think that they have. The fact is, the power is in the people. The power is in the choices of the people, and we leave our choices to be guided by our media, by our entertainment, and of course by our politicians. And of course it is coordinated. None of this is made to be in the hands of Americans. It's just not. And the trade war itself is just a giant propaganda tool, right? It's not going to have the effects that people think it's going to. I mean, the whole idea of bringing jobs back to America is something that sounds fantastic. It's something that we would all love. It doesn't matter if you're left, if you're right, if you're in the center, if you're a Republican or Democrat. Everybody wants more jobs, better paying jobs in America for everybody. Full stop. That's what people want. But at the same time, to do it by just trying to put tariffs on other countries, it doesn't make sense. I mean, I get the idea of it, right? But if you really think things through, America really can't fight that. Not with China, not with Russia. These are old countries. Their cultures are old. Their people are resilient and have been through external pressures for generations. American people haven't been through any pressure. We make our decisions and there's really never any consequence except for the debt that we end up carrying. It's very easy to make mistakes in America and bounce back, and within margins, of course, because you're going to be staying in a state of powerlessness, essentially. But in a lot of these foreign cultures, the people, they just are more resilient, and they think of things in the long term. The American mind really only goes by the media cycle. It doesn't really focus on problems that long, and that is a massive problem of why we can't get things handled here. So we can talk all day about how we want to change things. We can talk all day about the trade war and are we going to win with China, and we got to make them pay. They have to do worse so that we can do better. Instead of having all ships rise together, which I know may sound naive, and I understand that, because every country has their own interest in some kind of supremacy. And that's something that we need to understand and confront. But at the same time, does America actually have the tools to do that fight? Because, like I said, China and Russia are countries that will fight things out for generations. And we got a taste of that in Afghanistan. You're not just going to go in and beat a people. America is great at many things. But when it comes to warfare, long drawn-out warfare isn't our thing. Because the mentality we have is changeable. The policies change every few years. We're good at total war. But in the absence of total war, when we're restricted and held back by certain policies, and we have to fight the long game, we will always fail, because that's not how our mind works. We need to go in and really put the pressure on the way that we're used to, and that's just by applying it hard, scorched earth. That's what we know. But the idea that the battle fought today doesn't matter because the war is fought 100 years from now is not something that Americans understand, because even on the individual level, we see things from a very personalized view. There's no idea of national legacy anymore, and that really does hurt us more than we think, especially when it comes to global trade, because a lot of these leaders that are in there for life, there is actually a benefit to that, and that's because they're going to set up their legacy, whether their historical legacy, they can maintain a strategy over decades. Short-term wins are one thing, but long-term gains are another. And that's how these people think. Generational advances, right? How our country looks like in 100 years. The problem with America is what our country looks like in 4 years. And there is a lot of strength in democracy and in a democratic republic. There's a lot of strength in that, and it's great that we have the representation that we have, but we can't fight every battle in our way. Because when we enter things like drawn-out trade wars or wars against terror, where the ideology of the people that we're facing and the strategy that they're willing to use stretches over lifetimes, that's not something that we can compete with. Because if we can't get it done in a few years, we will just let go and give up. And if you're our opponent and you know that that's how we look at war, whether that's economic war, whether that's actual war, that's a huge advantage. It's a huge advantage because it just means you just got to stick it out. You just got to stick it out and you got to suffer a little bit. And usually in those kind of economies and those kind of nations, they're used to that kind of pressure. They're used to hardship in a way that Americans just aren't. And we're not willing to really put up with it. So trying to go into a trade war with China inevitably is going to lead to failure because the American people don't necessarily want it because we can't take it. You can say, well, we need to suffer in the short term. But the fact is, American people know that once Trump is out of power, a lot of these tariffs and a lot of these sanctions and a lot of the strategic moves that have been made to advance the American position are going to get pulled back and thrown away, or they're going to be minimized and rolled up into a new policy that's going to give China or Russia, in one way or another, either working with companies or working with lobbyists or diplomats, to really give them the benefits that they need to stop the trade war, even if it's quietly. Because the only alternative is for this to become a hot war, and that's not something that anybody wants. That's something that will win. Absolutely, because America's great at total war. And that's why America hasn't been drawn into total war by any other superpowers, because we are good at that. You pull in the full force of America's military might, they will crush you. But if you treat them like the Romans treated Hannibal, and you just pick at their supply chains, and you pick them off piece by piece, and you demoralize them, and eventually you can wipe them out. And that's what a lot of these countries are doing. And it's pretty easy to see. And for some reason, we don't see it. They won't take us seriously. And the thing is, at this point, why should they? Why should other countries take America seriously? It's a real question, because how can you take someone seriously other than our military might? How can you take a country seriously when they change directions every 4 years? How can they be in charge? I mean, if anything, you'd want to ostracize them globally, really, because, they're a threat to themselves. It's like trying to do business with a madman who changes his mind all the time. Especially as our political divide widens and the narratives and the desires of the different segments of the population that dictate the direction of where the country is going change so drastically that political and ideological swing that happens every 4 years has much more consequence than it used to have. Because there used to not be much of a difference between a Democrat and a Republican, but look at it now. They're two different species of human beings at this point, whether we'd like to believe that or not. The people who live in two completely different realities. And how can you do business with that on the long term? If you don't know, for the most of the world, America's a place that you go in, you make money, and then you leave. It's not somewhere that, as far as business-wise, you set up roots, really. You don't respect in the same way like you're going to be doing business for generations. That's not how the rest of the world sees America. We're a place to harvest resources, really. You come here, you harvest money, and then you leave. It's not a respectable country in the eyes of most of the world, and that's a real shame. And like I said, a lot of that is because of kind of this social psychosis that we seem to be going through. And I think a lot of us are in denial if we don't think that a trade war is going to have a negative impact on our lives individually. Either with the cost of goods going up. We look at the housing market the way that it is now, and we say, oh, the prices are going to crash, right? And like I said, this is what they do. They'll go up and down, up and down, up and down. But they're always going to go up because the inflation and the devaluation of the US dollar, assets out of necessity, need to keep going up in price. Even if there's less demand because they get more expensive, it doesn't mean the asset is going to become any cheaper. Barring some kind of massive disaster, that's just not going to happen, right? The selling price might go down, but the value itself won't. And that would always, of course, be temporary. But housing aside, the big thing for me when it comes to the trade war, and for many of us, should be its effect on cost of living. Because the effect of a trade war, the effect of tariffs against a country that we just cannot beat because they think generationally and not by a political cycle, I mean, we can't play that game. They'll wait us out, and that's the way that it is. And like I said, because these are more oppressive countries, people don't realize that, oppressive countries usually breed the most nationalistic people. It's not people who have a ton of freedom, because people who have a ton of freedom usually become very ungrateful and very privileged. And I think that that's something that we see in America. We see incredibly privileged people living privileged lives, essentially in a golden cage. But to the rest of the world, it's a golden cage of crazy people who really don't know what their next step is. So it's pretty easy to beat someone who doesn't know what they're doing if you've done anything in life. But that's where we are. It's a fascinating time to be alive. And, individually, we need to start taking care of ourselves and realize that the system may have worked in the decades past, but I don't think that it's designed to really work in the future as the rest of the world catches up economically and technologically with America. When we had all the cards on our side, yeah, it's easy to be top dog. But when you mix kind of the indecisiveness of our political structure with the fickleness of the people and their inability to actually enact change or have any discipline in their consumeristic behaviors, you put that against more traditional nations who still have a focus on family and growth and think about things, like I said, 100 years in the future. There's really not much we can do against a nation like that except obliterate them with missile strikes. That's all you can do to really defeat an enemy like that in the case of America. So anyway, it's crazy stuff. So thanks for sticking with me through this deep dive. And if you like this kind of content, like and subscribe, share, all that stuff. And let me know what you think about the trade war in the comments section. Do you think it's going to work, or do you think it's just a matter of time before the whole thing collapses? I'd love to hear your thoughts. And until next time, from the Large Man Abroad family, we thank you. We always thank you for the support. Thank you for stopping by. And we hope you guys have a good one.